but you also need a clear vision of where you want to go. And there clearly just hasn't been one of those in the last 13 years. I mean, you just look at we've had corporation tax going up and corporation tax coming down. We've had deep austerity and then a lot of spending. We've had 15, absurd numbers of secretaries of state in most of the big departments. So we've had no sort of consistency of approach.
Welcome. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us here today for the IEA Book Club with our special guest, Paul Johnson. My name is Lesh, and I'm the Director of Public Policy and Communications here at the IEA. Just a few housekeeping points before we get into the main event tonight. We are filming this, both the discussion and the Q&A, and it will be subsequently released on the IEA's YouTube channel. We'll begin the discussion tonight with a discussion between myself and Paul on the book, probably around 25 minutes or so, and then we'll open up to questions from the floor, where you'll have the opportunity to speak. We do have a microphone that will be coming around, so please speak into that. Please, of course, turn your mobile phones to silence. In terms of the restrooms, the women's lavatories are out the back and downstairs, while the gents can be found by exiting this room out the back as well, turning left, making your way through the garden, and then the bathrooms on the right. With that now out of the way, I'm delighted to introduce tonight's guest speaker. So Paul, as many of you will know, is the director of the IFS, a position he's held since January 2011. He's a visiting professor at University College London. He's worked and published extensively on the economics of public policy, with a particular focus on income distribution, public finances, pensions, tax, social security, education, and climate change. And you can tell that from this book that he has very broad, much like myself, very broad and interests and a lot of depth of knowledge as well. He's received a CBE for his contribution to economics. His career before the IFS included stints with the Treasury, Department for Education, and the FSA. He was also the deputy head of the Government Economic Service, and is a member of the Committee on Climate Change, as well as the Banking Standards Board. And if that wasn't enough, he was also the editor of the Murrell's Review on the UK tax system. So thank you very much for joining us here tonight. And of course, we're here to discuss Paul's book, which will be available for purchase later, which is, I've got in my hand here, Follow the Money. So I kind of want to start, Paul, with just very broadly, why did you write this book? What got you out of bed that day?
Well, I mean, the honest answer is that occasionally when I've been at the IFS, publishers have come and said, "Can you write a book?" And I said, "No, don't be ridiculous. How can I possibly do that on top of a job that takes about 70 hours a week?" But they kept pestering, and eventually I said, "All right then." And I was right first time. It was it was an extremely inefficient process of half a day every sort of month or two to get it done. But I suppose, I mean, the real answer is that I've sort of worked across a range of these areas. I think I had some interesting things to say. I think there's a lot of stuff out there which is not so helpful. So I actually wanted to get something into the public domain which talked about, how we raise £1 trillion a year, how we spend that, and why things consistently go wrong in how we do it, and hopefully some ideas about how we might do it better.
Yeah, so it's a very broad book in terms it goes from, to discussion about tax reforms, the welfare state, to pensions. I think there were some kind of central themes in I would say, perhaps your one central theme is this idea that there's no easy answers. I was wondering if you could tell us your kind of thinking along those lines and what you mean by there's no easy answers, because I think there's kind of a question in my mind from reading it, is it that there's no easy answers when it comes to the economics of kind of fiscal policy, government expenditure? Is it that there are no easy answers when it comes to distributional consequences, or is it something more to with the politics?
I mean, to be honest, that's one of the reasons I wanted to write it, because I think there aren't easy answers. If there were, someone somewhere would have done it. And that's but also one of the reasons why I was reluctant to write a book, because most books have a theme, which is, if you tax the rich, everything will be fine, or we have a universal basic income, or you sort of privatise everything, or nationalise everything, or it's all to do with lemons, or whatever the strange kind of books you get are. And there isn't a theme like that in here. There isn't a sort of, if you do this, everything will be fine. It really is. But once you look at these issues, it's not straightforward. And actually, one of the reviews you can probably guess which broadsheet it was, said, well, this isn't a particularly good book because it doesn't say just tax the rich and everything will be solved. Well, no, it doesn't say that, because that's not how you're going to solve everything. And it doesn't matter what you look at. The point is, there are always trade-offs. So if you look at welfare, you can either give more money to poor people to make them better off, and have a stiff means test, which means that you really damage work incentives, or you give them less money, in which case you make them worse off. Or you can have a universal basic income, which I'm very rude about in there, in which case you just tax everyone at 70% in order to pay for it. And there are just really hard trade-offs there. If you look at sort of health, we spend enormous amounts on the health service, but no more than most other countries. The outcomes aren't particularly good in the UK, but it's very hard to have a debate about what we do in health. If you look at tax, there are lots of things that we should be doing to the tax system to make it better, but some people lose. You can't really change taxes without making some people lose, unless you're just cutting, and that's straightforward. Cutting isn't an option in the long run. And actually, in terms of reform, if you're reforming it, then you're going to make people worse off, and politicians don't like doing that. And so there are trade-offs, because you make some people worse off even if you make the system as a whole better. And the same is true in spades for growth. We should clearly be reforming the planning system, but some people will be made worse off. We could clearly be building more roads and houses, but some people will be made worse off, and so on and so on.
Yeah, so it seems to me, the easy is the emphasis here, which is there are answers. There are, in my mind at least, there are a lot of, in fact, you go through a lot of them in your book. Just on the tax side, I started making a list. You can abolish NICs and combine it with income tax, apply VAT more consistently, reform the council tax system, introduce a LVT, unfreeze income tax. There's all sorts of things. Maybe some of them have, expenditure and trade-offs. But it seems to me that, and I think you say it's one case, is quite often in fiscal debates, it's the politics that wins.
Yeah, you missed the most important one in my book, the one I'm really obsessed by, which you need to abolish stamp duty land tax.
Yes, of course, yes, sorry. It is in my list written here, actually.
But yes, those of a certain age remember Norman Lamont trying to put VAT on domestic fuel consumption, and that one of the things that resulted in him being sacked and the Conservatives losing the election a few years later. It's really hard to make some of these changes. And one of the things I say several times through there to the reader is, don't just blame the politicians. It's your fault as a voter. It's an issue about the voting public, or the way that we think about it, that it does make it very hard for politicians to be brave in the sort of yes minister, courageous in that sense, because it seems to me fairly obvious we ought to have a council tax which is based on relatively recent values and which isn't regressive in the value of the property. But a lot of people would be made worse off if you do that, and therefore it's incredibly hard. And the closest we got was under when Gordon Brown was Chancellor, had this massive review of doing it, done by some Lions, the Lions Review, completely ignored. So he got the chairmanship of the BBC instead. It's kind of, these things are politically difficult. And I can't remember which European politician who said it was. We know what to do. We just don't know how to get re-elected afterwards. And I think there's a kind of an issue there.
Do you think it's gotten harder to do those kind of reforms that, I suppose in a technocratic sense have a pretty broad consensus, but politically might be toxic or difficult in some ways? Over time, have politicians shied away from more of those, do you think?
I think it's. I don't know why it would have got harder particularly. I think there were big reforms obviously in the 80s, and we saw big reforms to whether it be to the tax system, although a lot of that was using. There were some big cuts there, which are always easier, and all sorts of big reforms in public service and privatisation and so on. there was a lost period for some of this under the Blair Brown years. I mean, we're looking at looking at changing the structure of school funding, for example. Much easier to do when there's lots of money around than it is when there's not much money around. I mentioned the failure to do council tax. I think you kind of need to be reasonably confident that you've got a couple of terms in the bag. So a big majority helps quite a lot in terms of being able to do make significant change. But you also need a clear vision of where you want to go, and there clearly just hasn't been one of those in the last 13 years. I mean, you just look at we've had corporation tax going up and corporation tax coming down. We've had deep austerity and then a lot of spending. We've had 50, absurd numbers of secretaries of state in most of the big departments. So we've had no sort of consistency of approach within a single sort of party, as it were, and absolute flip-flops on quite a lot of policy. So I don't think that's because it's difficult. I don't think it's because it's become more difficult. I think that's because we haven't had a very clear sense of direction.
Yeah, and you would think maybe you need a clear sense of direction, also maybe even some kind of a political crisis or some kind of impetus.
We've had a few of those.
Well, indeed, but kind of a crisis that could be then taken advantage of to make a case for reform. If I'm thinking about Thatcher's model of reform, there was we have a clear setup where the economy is going badly in all these ways, and then a narrative and an agenda from there, which I think you're right, we haven't had, and I don't necessarily is on the horizon. I think another kind of key theme in the book, and one particularly pessimistic from this audience, although perhaps should be pessimistic for anyone, which is you write about how you believe tax rises are inevitable based upon the current kind of fiscal outlook. Do you want to go into that thought?
Yeah, so taxes are currently rising to the highest level in the UK ever. It's a remarkable thing that through most of my life, taxes have been between 32 and 34% of national income, and they've been there for about 60, 70 years actually, with the odd spike up and down. Whilst we have massively grown the welfare state. I mean, we're spending 3 times as much as a fraction of national income on health as we were, and we're spending more on pensions and so on. But we've done that by how on earth have we managed that? Well, we've abolished defence spending essentially. We've stopped building houses. We've privatised student finance. We've privatised, nationalised industries, and we went through a significant period of austerity in the early 2010s. But going forward, health spending is almost certainly going to continue to rise. It just always does, and the pressure on that is up from demography and from costs and so on. I don't think is going to go away. We're going to see a big increase in the size of the population over state pension age over the next decades. So it's hard to see how you don't get an increase in spending on pensions and health over the next decades. Of course, we've got in the short run, we've got dreadful growth. We're spending more on debt interest than we have since the early 1960s, and I don't think that's going to stop either. And there's no more defence to abolish. In fact, that's probably going to go up. So it's I haven't seen the proposals which say we're going to take a big knife to the NHS, or we're going to abolish local government, or whatever, which are the only sort of scale of things which I think will stop taxes rising. So I'm not saying it's inevitable in the sense that you can't do it. I mean, you can have a more private healthcare system. You can decide to charge people for education. You can decide to have means-tested pensions, and all of those things exist in different developed countries. But it doesn't seem to me that that's in the least bit likely in the UK. And if none of that happens, which I would bet quite high that it won't, then I think almost perforce we will at most, or at least kind of have taxes staying at the level they're going to hit in a couple of years' time, and more likely than not rising from them. But I'd be very, very surprised if they get back to the 32 to 34% of national income they've been over most of my life.
Yeah, I mean, I think that effectively says where we're kind of stuck is in a situation where there's relatively low growth, very possibly the case, where there's not much of a willingness of politicians to substantially reform public services in a way that might make them more efficient or more effective for the amount you put into them. But do we then end up in I suppose, a very bad trajectory here where, I mean, you note some work in the book that's been done at the IFS that a quarter of the top 1% of income earners were born overseas. So you have a very large number of people born overseas, probably could move back to another country if they feel like the taxes are too burdensome in the UK, and perhaps some are already making those kind of decisions. We certainly see some companies are making those decisions in response to higher corporate taxes. Are you stuck in a kind of bad equilibrium there for the kind of stagnating economy and stagnating public services and not a little bit of extra revenue, effectively something a little bit like what Scotland has, which is higher income tax but not that much more revenue and poor quality services despite funding them more? Yeah,
I mean there's lots in that. I'd pick out a couple of things. One is that most Western European economies are doing at least as well as us, so they've got significantly higher tax burdens. So there isn't there's by no means a one-for-one correspondence between high levels of tax and poor economic performance. Second, you're absolutely right, though, higher levels of tax or higher levels of spending are not themselves in any sense good. And I do say about Scotland there that they spend a lot more on education than England, for example, and they do much worse. They've increased their income tax rates quite a lot and raised very little additional revenue because their economy has done worse. Now, I don't think it's done worse because they've raised income tax, but it has done worse than that in England. But the broader point about the sort of top 1% is really important. We are incredibly dependent on a very small number of people and a very small number of companies actually to pay a very large fraction of tax. And if you look at income tax, that 1% of people pay 30% of income tax, and 0.1% pay something like 7 or 8% of income tax, so like 80 times their weight in the population. And that, of course, because they've got lots and lots of money. But it's a dangerous place to be, it seems to be so dependent for so much revenue on such a small number of people. And not least because, and I think it's actually something like a third of the top 0.1% are foreign born, partly because they're coming to work in the City of London, and so on. And so, if we do anything to chase them away, then we lose that. And the last point, which I think is really important, I think there are sort of there's a lot of magical thinking about tax, and there's one bit of magical thinking in my view is that we can cut taxes because it's easy to save 50 billion or 100 billion out of public spending. I don't think that's true. But equally, there's another element of magical thinking which says we can fund all of the public services by taxing the rich. Well, we already do, and actually there is no country in the world with a higher tax burden than we do which gets it from taxing the rich. They all get it, bad news, from taxing normal people. I mean, that's what happens in continental Europe. I mean, they have higher tax burdens, but not by getting a pile of money out of super rich people, but by actually, I'm afraid, having a higher burden on people on sort of average and twice average incomes.
I mean, is there an intrinsic problem with the structure of the tax system? If it is too dependent on a small number of high earners, it seems like the only logical alternative to that is to have a less progressive tax system. You could become less dependent on those highest earners just by middle income earners being taxed a bit more, but I doubt many would politically be willing to walk down that line, except for perhaps Liz Truss, and it wasn't so successful getting rid of the 45p.
Well, that's the point of, so you can do this in two ways. Obviously, you can increase taxes across the board, but what you can't do, which some people seem to suggest, is get 100 billion from some tiny fraction of rich people and big corporations. You just can't. So if you really want to, as some people suggest, and I'm not suggesting this, if you really want to spend a lot more on public services, you really have to tax ordinary people. And that's what I say. I think there's magical thinking on both sides of this debate. There's the magical thinking that there's 100 billion we could just cut out the state just like that, and we could cut taxes. There's another set of magical thinking: we could spend another 100 billion, and the only people who have to pay are sort of the Duke of Westminster and no one else. It's just nonsense.
I just want to kind of spend a little bit of time on one of the specific areas of public spending, perhaps the biggest and the growing one you do discuss quite extensively in the book, of course, which is the NHS. Now, you suggest that you foresee the NHS requiring, in real terms, of 4% per year above inflation spending increases. Now, of course, the NHS is national religion, the last centralised it's kind of Soviet part of the British economy, all sorts of fantastic quotes you've got in there about it. It seems to me, before thinking about spending more money on the NHS, you really do need a proper debate about reform. And I'm not saying there's any chance of a fully privatised system, but at the same time, it doesn't seem that sustainable to me just to say, oh, let's put another 4% a year into it forever until it takes up 100% of GDP and that's it. Like, I appreciate the point about an ageing population, but if the system is dysfunctional, and in the past was this idea, well, the UK spends, by European standards, kind of an average, maybe slightly below average level on healthcare, but gets decent outcomes, and at least in the last few years, and on track to spend around average, if not more than European average on healthcare and the NHS, and yet is getting significantly worse outcomes than you would expect. Is it really a fiscal question, or is it more of a public sector reform question? I think it's the same kind of question on a whole bunch of different policy areas.
Well, it depends what you mean by reform here. I mean, the first thing to say is the NHS is not, in broad terms, is not really unusual. I mean, most developed countries, the US apart, have a publicly funded, broadly speaking, free at the point of use health service. The NHS is a bit unusual in its being funded directly from from general taxation, and it's more monolithic than most systems. But actually, the differences are not that huge in the kind of high level structure. And we'd spend a perfectly normal amount as a fraction of national income on health, and all countries are facing these increases in health spending. And the US system is disastrous, and some European systems are rather better. If you look at health outcomes in this country, they're bad. The NHS is bad at keeping us alive if we have cancer or what have you. And you wouldn't believe that from some of the discussions you get. And one of the things that really annoys me is politicians going on the telly and saying, the NHS is great, look, it's so much better than the US. Well, in many ways, yes, it is, but that's a bit like saying the English cricket team's great, we can beat France. I mean, it's kind of, it's not a sensible comparison. So what do we mean by reform here? I think it's a really big and interesting question. I don't think changing the funding model is likely to help. I mean, you could charge people to go to GPs, but we charge prescriptions and we raise an incredibly small amount of money from it because 90% of prescriptions are free. And I think we would end up being forced to make a very high fraction of GP consultations free, for example. You could move to a social insurance model like they have in a lot of European systems, but that's kind of just historically, that's based on a particular historical basis on how these things are being funded. And exactly what the benefit of doing that would be, I don't know. So I think a lot of this is really about this kind of really difficult and micro issues around how do we manage this? Why the hell have we still not got a workforce strategy for the NHS? It's absolutely absurd. We've undertrained nurses, we've undertrained doctors for decades, and we've never published a proper strategy for that. Talk to anyone in the NHS and they'll tell you it's a terrible manager of people. That's not, I mean, it's different in different parts, but on average it is just a dreadful place to work for a lot of people, which it really shouldn't be. And then we tried every decade or so to reform bits of this in a way that really haven't worked terribly well. So I can't remember. I got a list of sort of 6 things we need to, or 6 or 7 things at the end of that chapter that we need to get right. I mean, we need to have consistency. I was talking to the chief executive of one of the new integrated care boards, which is sort of one of those things, one of the new bits of NHS infrastructure that runs. She runs basically about a quarter of London, and she said, well, look, this is May, and I've only just got my budget for this financial year. So 6 weeks in the financial year, I've only just found out my budget. We know we're going to get some kind of bung later in the year, but we've got no idea how big the bung's going to be. So how the hell am I supposed to manage that? And a lot of what I've got to do is just about sort of corralling and influencing people. I can't actually kind of make anything very much happen. And this is one of the most impressive public sector leaders I've ever met. And sort of it's incredibly difficult to manage this. So which is a long way of saying, don't ask an economist, ask someone who knows something about management. But it's a kind of, it clearly needs a lot of work. But I don't think, to use the phrase, it's not another top top-down reorganisation or re-disorganisation, and it's not, I think, changing the sort of the funding model. It's a much more sort of fundamental sort of top-down and bottom-up issue about sort of just getting the nuts and bolts of the running of the system right.
So I think my colleague Christian Niemitz here, who does quite a lot of comparative work in terms of healthcare systems, I think he would make an argument that part of the issue, in fact, is much as you might try to fiddle with the kind of things and very good and important things to do, you're just going to end up finding more issues because of the very structure and nature of the system, that the NHS is this kind of too large, uncontrollable, disorganised system with poor incentives for good management and good expenditure and good use of resources, that you could actually have a substantial benefit if we were willing to move to a social insurance system, because it would by changing the funding model, you'd change the incentives, and you could have a much more true, rather than kind of not actually decentralised system, have a truly more decentralised decision-making system with better managers on the ground managing individual hospitals in a way that is responsive to patient needs and patient wants.
Well, I agree.
A system with more patient choice. I don't know, but my question is, I think the goals are the same in terms of what you want. Let's give patients more choice, but it's a question of maybe a social insurance system would be the way to achieve those goals rather than the current funding model. Yeah. Maybe I'm just a dreamer, as thinking, or maybe it's partly, I suppose our role here at the IEA is to push on those things. Before we open to questions from the audience, I just want some kind of final thoughts in terms of at least something that can square a lot of some of this, which is the economic growth puzzle. Now, of course, you can both have a better funded NHS and lower taxes if you have a bigger economy, a bigger pie in which everyone can get at least a little bit more. What can we do to get the growth engine going?
Yeah, I mean that's true. What you say is true up to a point, and one of the reasons actually that spending in pounds terms on the NHS has fallen behind some other countries is because our economy has fallen behind some other countries. But actually, of course, if everyone's earnings are rising, then we need to increase the pay of nurses and doctors and so on. But it seems to me we kind of, in the long run, we broadly know a series of things we need to do to get growth, and actually, Whitehall knows, and they literally decide not to do it. So we know that reforming planning significantly is necessary for growth, but we literally decide not to do it. We know that higher capital spending would be good for growth, and certainly in the early 2010s we took an axe to that, although to be fair, in the more recent years we've increased that. We know that education is absolutely crucial to growth, and yet we cut spending on particularly the most important bits, further and vocational education, through the 2010s. We know that there are a series of tax reforms that should be good for growth, and sorry to go on about it, but abolishing stamp duty would be a good start. And we decide, actually we've increased it and increased it and increased it. So there are a whole series of things that we actually know would be good for growth, and for political, I think largely political and maybe occasionally ideological reasons, we decide not to do them. Now, there is clearly a political problem here, because everything I've said there, it's going to take 10 years before you see the consequences. As I also quote in there, there's this great video of Nick Clegg in 2011 saying there's no point building nuclear power stations because they won't come on. It won't be operational till 2022. Well, surprisingly enough, 2022 arrived, and we kind of needed them. And actually, so 2032 and 2042 and 2052 will arrive, so you need to take these long-term. These long-term decisions, which might be difficult in the short run, might not sort of make much difference in the short run. Actually, the other thing I do say in there as well, and there's a chapter there on local government and devolution and so on. I cannot prove this, but I'm pretty sure that devolving power from Westminster would help as well.
Yeah, I mean, there is at the very least good research on devolving tax and spend power and better educational and health and other outcomes for people in local areas, yeah. At least in correlational studies. Let's open questions just here at the front.
I think I need another drink.
Hold on just 1 second. You did get up your hand first, yes, but just wait for the microphone.
You got it up for me. You're the biggest blogger in the room, I know. But I have a serious question for you. But before I ask the question, I got one comment. I was delighted to hear you advocate the abolition of stamp duty. It's just such a sea anchor behind our economy, and I'd like you to add to that stock exchange stamp duty as well. We're losing stock exchange business left, right, and centre. That's by the by. My question is, I've had an idea for some time that we should put VAT on food, and we spend 120 billion every year on food and non-alcoholic drinks. That's excluding catering and excluding alcoholic drinks, as you be clear. I believe if you put 20% VAT on it, and let's assume that we have got an obesity problem as well. So he said a great idea would be for people to reduce their spending from 120 billion to 100 billion, and then we put the VAT on it, which is 20 billion off, so it's still the same amount. We'd get 20 billion of extra tax. What is wrong with that?
Well, so one of the things I say, and I can't remember exactly the words I use, but something that I say is something like, one of the reasons people don't like economists is because we go around saying things like you should put VAT at the same rate on everything, including food. Good. Because you've got this absurd system at the moment where you've got these, you have to draw these boundaries between what has VAT on what doesn't. So a gingerbread man with chocolate eyes doesn't, but if you put a chocolate belt on him, he does. And Jaffa cakes, the famous Jaffa cakes. I mean, my main advice to you is if you want to get a pet, get a rabbit, because there's no VAT on rabbits because they're edible. But slightly more seriously, and if you do put VAT on something like food, you can raise enough money to compensate people on low incomes and have money left over if that's what you want to do. But you will always leave someone worse off, someone who spends a particularly large fraction of their budget on food, as we saw with fuel. I mean, actually, if you look back at 1993 proposals on putting VAT on domestic fuel, they were overall redistributive because this involved quite a big increase in benefits. But clearly, there are some people on low incomes who spend a lot on domestic fuel because they've got big, windy, drafty houses or what have you. But then you have to ask yourself the question, is it appropriate to be subsidising that particular group of people at the expense of everyone else? That's a really hard thing to say publicly and certainly politically, but I agree with you. I think we should have VAT essentially at the same rate across the board on pretty much everything, and that stops, and again I've got in there, that stops you having teams of people in HMRC whose job it is to decide whether, again to use a quote in there, whether a sort of particularly skimpy bit of clothing is intended for children or for people going on holiday to Ayia Napa.
Yeah, at the front again, why not? Work our way around. Got over time.
Thank you. I so many notes, I won't go and say anything about them. Apart from we work in tech in the NHS, and the problems there are huge, but can be solved, I think, quite in management can be solved very easily, but you've got essentially at least 3 management structures, none of which actually are aligned. The question I want to ask, and it's slightly non-serious, I guess, if the population, the elderly population is getting bigger, and we've got few people filling in, then the only way it can possibly work and taxes to remain the same rate or lower is for per capita incomes to rise on average. So, do you think that we should, because incentives matter in economics, right? So do you think that we should peg MPs and civil servants' pay to people's per capita disposable income or a median disposable income? Because either they get it higher, in which case we all get richer, or we'll all be laughing at them as they get massive pay docs.
Well, I mean,
just spite.
Incentive pay for.
Actually, to be fair, civil service pay has gone down a lot relative to average incomes and earnings over the last 15 years. I'm not sure it's so excellent if you actually want good people to be doing those jobs. There's a broader issue here. If you want to keep the same quality of people in the public sector, then you need their wages to go up broadly in line with what's happening in the private sector. And possibly more if you're looking at teachers and nurses now who don't have the opportunity to work at home, whereas most of their most graduate professions do. And of course we've done exactly the opposite over the last significant period. So I don't know what the right salary is for a civil servant or a teacher or a nurse. What I do know is you can't just keep cutting it relative to everyone else.
we are turning down the Singapore model where very high salaries for kind of top bureaucrats in the hope of best and brightest rather than the mediocre. But I suppose that's not going to be politically particularly viable. Maybe towards the back there.
I'm an accountant in business, and a lot of my job is budgeting and forecasting. And I find it bizarre that the government has outsourced the forecasting function to the OBR rather than own the assumptions that go into it. Do you think there's an argument for bringing that back in-house, given that there'll always be organisations such as the IFS to keep the government honest and call out any magical thinking?
No, I don't actually. I quite like what's happened with the OBR. I mean, remember why it happened. I mean, it happened essentially because there was a significant and I think well-placed suspicion that under at the time, the last Labour government, but I think it's been more broadly, that the macroeconomic assumptions that were built into budget numbers were overly optimistic. Actually, as it turned out, the OBR has been overly optimistic, but for other reasons. I mean, because things have turned out so bad over the last 13 years. So I think there are things wrong with the OBR process, and I think chancellors understandably find it very frustrating that that they don't have a control over this system where the OBR comes back with different forecasts, and they have to kind of make things add up on the basis of a sort of slightly external body. But I do think we've had it's had lots of very big positives. One is that right or wrong, their forecasts are honest. They've put a lot more information in the public domain, which I think has been a big and unsung sort of part of the positives here. And it gives credibility to chancellors in terms of what they're doing fiscally. And actually, I think we've probably underused that credibility. We've kept to the same kinds of very sort of mechanistic fiscal rules, which they then get gamed in the same way they've always been gamed. But actually, if you've got a sort of independent organisation there, they can provide you with a more qualitative sense of whether you've got the fiscal policy under control. So, broadly speaking, I think the OBR is a good thing, and I think that having those kinds of forecasts done independently is a good thing. I should say that is an entirely different thing from what a lot of people talk about and say, well, why don't we use the OBR model for setting tax rates or for designing fiscal policy or for running? But those are the political decisions. I mean, we have to have the politicians, for good or bad, making the decisions about what actually happens. But I think having the forecasts being unimpeachable in terms of their integrity, even if they're wrong, is actually really important.
Isn't just a small thought there from Chairman's prerogative? Is there a bit of risk that the OBR kind of, I suppose, creates a certain institutional incentive in respect to kind of the type of policies that you do? And I say this as someone who's pretty pro-immigrant, but the OBR model suggests the higher you put up the immigration numbers, the more then you can plan to spend over the coming years. As far as I'm aware, the OBR doesn't do a lot of work on, let's say, planning reform. If the government announced a major planning reform, I don't know whether that would necessarily go straight into the OBR figures in the same way. Is that what can be counted is then having kind of institutional bias, or the way things are counted has an institutional bias in terms of the policies that are then made. Am I overthinking this?
So I think in terms of, if you've got a higher workforce, you've got a bigger economy, then sort of you doesn't need an independent OBR to tell you that. In terms of sort of the impact of whether it's planning reform or whether it's sort of infrastructure investment. I mean, I do hear this a lot, and I've got some sympathy with this, that the OBR tends not to offer you very big returns, as it were, on those changes. Now, part of the reason is that it's only looking over a maximum 5-year period. And whilst I absolutely believe that planning reform it would make, if real and big, would make a big positive impact on the economy. How much difference it make in 5 years, I'm not sure. But I'm not sure that I'm not, to be honest, sure whether the OBR has ever been asked in a budget sort of to cost the impact of planning reform on what growth would be. The childcare changes announced in the last budget, OBR sort of made an estimate of that would increase the workforce by 80,000 or something. So that there are behavioural impacts in there, but I don't think it creates an institutional bias against some of these changes in a way that's different from what will be the case anyway, because the danger, of course, is you just get politicians saying, well, I'm going to do this set of policies, and of course that will then will mean that growth will be 3% a year into the indefinite future, which is kind of the mistake that we've made time and time again. I mean, that's one of Nigel Lawson's huge mistake in the 1980s. It was also Gordon Brown's huge mistake in the 2000s, and the consequences of those sorts of mistakes are enormous.
Just here at the front.
Obviously, you've been in the data game a while now. I was wondering, and forecasts are regularly right, sometimes regularly wrong. I was wondering, are there any institutions or any individuals that you really respect, and are there any that you really don't respect?
Name and shame, yeah.
Well, tell me which ones are regularly right. I haven't found them right, but look, I mean, I respect the independent forecasters, even if they are wrong. So I respect the OBR forecasts and the Bank of England forecasts, even probably the OBR more than the bank, to be honest. Given the information that they've got to deal with, but macroeconomic forecasts are always going to end up being wrong. But you've got so much going on that it's very hard to get them right, and they do the best they've got with the information that we've got available at any one time. And it is worth understanding how they do these things. I mean, it's very interesting contrasting the OBR with the Bank of England, and you'll have seen that the bank sort of said recently that their forecasts of inflation going forward have been wrong, partly because their model based on 30 years of data just kind of always forces the inflation back to 2% really quite quickly. Now that was clearly always wrong, actually. But they've been more model-based. The OBR, to an extraordinary extent, is judgment-based. So they make much less use of modelling and much more use of judgment. And in something this complex, I think there's something to be said for that. But actually, I've got a lot of respect for both, because they are doing the best they can within an unbelievably difficult world.
It seems though there is this bit of a tendency to look at, say the IMF's forecast that says the UK will perform worse than the G7, and then it doesn't perform worse than the G7, and then you get this, by 0.5%, you get this kind of obsession on these forecasts.
I think there's a strange obsession. I mean, the IMF is kind of forecasting every country in the world, so it's sort of it can give you some comparative numbers, but I'd put less weight on the actual numbers that the IFS comes up with than I would for a lot of organisations that are focused just on the UK. And then you get, as you say, these absurd focus on what the forecast is over the next year or what have you. Well, actually, it's kind of more interesting to see how things have changed over the past 3 years, or what is the difference between now and 2019 or what have you, which doesn't look pretty for the UK. But actually, we spend much too much time, I think, looking at these kind of extremely uncertain forecasts, and not enough time looking at what's happened and thinking, well, why has that happened?
Maybe this woman at the front here.
Given how serious the current economic situation is, and also the fact that we have an increasingly ageing population and an increasingly unwell population, and I'm not just referring to the fact that older people are going to take a greater amount of NHS resources, but also to the fact that the population is becoming increasingly unwell insofar as things like serious diseases like cancer are beginning to strike people at very much younger ages due to things like, in my view, bad diet and environmental toxicity and things like that. How do you see things in 10 years' time? And also, I'd like to know, do you think there's any chance that in a democracy, politicians will be able to make the difficult decisions necessary to steer us away from the worst case scenario?
Again, there's a lot in that. I mean, where are we economically at the moment? So given what happened through COVID, I think we could be quite thankful for we're not in a worse position. I think a lot of people would have thought we might have sort of mass unemployment, for example, now, and we really don't. So, we're not in recession this year, and I think that we might not do too badly over the next few years. I mean, some of the impacts of what's happening. So I don't know how this will go. Brexit has clearly reduced the size of the UK economy, but actually we've had a lot of that hit already. Politics is much less mad than it's been for the last 6 years, and I think that is actually good for the economy. And we've got a really quite strong labour market at the moment. The big problem with the economy at the moment is inflation and how quickly that can be squeezed out. And so if there's something that economically in the next 3 years worries me, it's squeezing inflation out. How the economy will grow over the next 10 years, I don't know, but there has to be at least a chance it does a bit better than the last 10 years. In terms of the sort of the other side of that, the sort of ageing of population and the sickness of the population, the thing that worries me most about sort of the health of the population is that it is indicative of other problems. So if you look at sickness and disability, a 30-year-old with no qualifications is on average way sicker than a 65-year-old who is well educated. Now that's just extraordinary, and that absolutely was not true 30 years ago. And it's an indication that the sickness is now much more a sort of socioeconomic inequality problem than it used to be, rather than an age problem. If you look at disability benefits, in the mid-1990s, some extraordinarily high fraction of men in their early 60s were on disability benefits. It's now right across the age distribution. You've got very high fractions of poorly educated people in their 20s and 30s, very often with mental health problems on these benefits. May or may not be measuring these correctly, but that's what's happening in terms of the benefits. And there has been a more than doubling in the last 2 years of the number of people applying for and being granted these benefits. So huge, extraordinary changes in a very short period, as well as a much broader change over time. And then you sort of talked about sort of sickness and ageing, and this is one of the reasons why I think it's going to be very hard to keep spending on health from going up, because as we get better off as a society, clearly we want to spend more. We want to live. Technology is expensive, and we have increasing levels of obesity and other sorts of problems through working life, which is one of the reasons why there's such a big socioeconomic divide in this, and that is very, very costly.
But do you think that politicians are going to be able to take the difficult decisions necessary, or do you think that they're just going to keep procrastinating things and things will just get worse and worse?
Well, the evidence isn't positive, is it?
Pessimistic note. Just this gentleman at the front, second row here.
Sorry, thank you very much. I was going to ask, maybe related to that question, what are the odds on either the British public getting, whether it's more sensible, or getting a little bit more serious about maybe some of the trade-offs you describe, and beyond that, to what extent can you fix some of these problems, whether it's in taxation or in the provision of some services, sort of by stealth, through small fixes made somewhere within the machine that aren't noticed and maybe sneak through?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I don't know how people are like to respond to policy options going forward, and whether that's going to change. I mean, some things you can change and are being changed by stealth. So the increase in the tax burden is being done quite deliberately in a way that's really quite stealthy. By the biggest bit is by freezing tax allowances and thresholds, which is dramatically changing the structure of the income tax system, but in a way which is not particularly evident to people. A lot of other changes in the taxes are much harder to do. If you want to sort of change council tax, you can't really do that by stealth. If you want to put VAT on food, I think people might notice. And if you look at sort of changes to changes the health service at one level, clearly if you start charging people, they're going to notice. Everything else, nobody has a clue about. It's completely opaque, and I think that's part of the problem about having a sensible conversation about health. It's utterly incomprehensible to everyone, including including me. I mean, there is a world of sort of people who understand a small world of people who understand the health service, and then there's the rest of us. But anything that doesn't actually change how how you pay for it, I don't think anyone's going to notice, and you can do that entirely stealthily. So it depends on the part of the system. I mean, in a sense, what are we doing with the state pension? We are stealthily increasing it through the use of the triple lock. Now, the sort of part of me thinks that's a dreadful policy because it's very untransparent. It's kind of results in the level of the state pension in 5 years' time being an entirely random number from here. But you can make a case for it, which is to say that you think that the state pension isn't high enough. I mean, I don't have a particularly strong view on that either way. But if it isn't high enough, then probably the best way of getting it up is to use something like the triple lock because it's completely untransparent. That is the argument for that kind of policy, and actually those sorts of untransparent policies, for obvious reasons, can be quite attractive to politicians.
This gentleman here on the end.
Thanks very much. You spoke about choices and so on, and sort of following up on the last question, but actually with something a bit more clear. 7 years ago, we voted to make ourselves poorer, in effect, and the politicians compounded that by the deal that they eventually did. Arguably, people voted on the basis that they recognised something was wrong and something had to be done, and something put in front of them was Brexit. Can you suggest anything that should have been put in front of the people, either then or now,
question.
that would have engendered a debate and would have led to a positive outcome?
That's a very good question. I completely agree, by the way, with your with your statement. What could have been put in front of them? I think that's where all of these trade-offs arise. I mean, what would have made us, what over a period of time would make us better off? I mean, I come back to the planning, tax, education, capital spending, competition policy. All of those things are important. But let me take that question away. As in, what is the question you could ask that would result in that outcome? It's a very interesting question.
We've got you stumped. Excellent. Just the gentleman at the back of the room.
Thank you. So policy trade-offs have been mentioned frequently this evening, one of the key reasons for economics' title of the one and only dismal science. Therefore, in the wake of a lack of social cohesion, geopolitical tensions, and a worsening climate, how can we manage the trade-offs which will inevitably arise from bold policy making?
Well, again, it's very different in different areas. I mean, one, I think, is just to be honest about them. I mean, and there's so much dishonesty in the debates. I mean, again, quoting things I say in my book, you get people saying, "Oh yes, universal basic income, that's a good idea. We should think about that." It's a terrible idea. I mean, just to be honest about it. Or we can raise 100 billion by taxing the rich. Well, no, you can't. You can privatise the NHS and all will be well, or whatever. So I think honesty is really important, and that's particularly true in tax. But I think that requires it takes a long time. I think is one of the problems here. That change in public services, change in growth, all of these things take a long time, and politicians, for obvious reasons, want to promise that things will change quickly. I mean, take levelling up. I mean, really important. I mean, in terms of productivity, the UK really is a genuinely unusually unequal country. Our Manchester and Birmingham and so on are absurdly unproductive relative to similar cities in the rest of Europe. But promising, in some sense, that you'll sort that out in a parliament is just for the birds. I mean, this is a sort of, it's a generational change if you want to achieve that. So we need to be clear about timescales about what's here, and then focus on it for a long period of time. And another failure, long-term failure of the UK system is the education system post-16. So it's kind of okay if you go and do A-levels and go to university, though I've got problems, some big problems with that. It's catastrophic for a lot of the other kids who don't do that. And we change the policy every 5 or 10 years with no sort of, nobody in the sort of the world that most of us live in really kind of focusing on that or worrying about it. It just kind of it affects another group of people. So actually engaging a broader group of people in some of this and making sure that their voices are heard, I think is sometimes important as well. But you probably tell from where I'm whittering on, I've got no sensible answer to your question.
I think you've had your hand up for a while.
I'm Edgar Warner, retired CEO of a NASDAQ-listed company. Do you think the government was right to stop fracking? Because that would have been a tremendous contribution almost immediately.
I suspect fracking would not have been a very big contribution given the very different geology here to the US, for example. I think there's a broader question here. So you've got fracking being stopped. You've got the opposition now saying they would stop new fields in the North Sea and so on. I absolutely think we need to get carbon emissions down and probably towards zero by 2050. But we do have to think very carefully about the role of the UK in that. And we've done, in terms of our production of emissions, we've cut them by, I can't remember the number, 40+% since 1990. But partly we've done that by importing a lot of emissions. So we've closed, a lot of manufacturing here is shut down, and we're bringing lots of stuff in from China where it's done worse. And I think we have to be very careful to know what is the consequence of some of the things that we're doing in terms of what happens elsewhere. So we could reduce our emissions quite a lot by closing down UK agriculture, but we probably end up just importing lots of stuff which has even more emissions involved. And we have to think very carefully about that in terms of if we stop fracking here, if we stop new fields in the North Sea, will that actually be better or worse or neutral for what happens across the world? And that's what really matters. And I don't know the answer to that, but I think
we're only 1.5% of carbon output in the world. What are we trying to make an example
just
of
this
ourselves?
this gentleman here who's had his hand up for a while, and then that lady there, and then that's probably all we have time for, unfortunately.
Can I ask you, do you believe that we should look at expenditure on university places, particularly those that don't generate much economic value, and instead transfer resources to vocational training?
I certainly think we should spend more on vocational education relative to university education than we do at the moment, and it's been extraordinary. The cuts to further education and vocational education and apprenticeship spending over the last 15 years have been extraordinary, and then before that they rose much less than elsewhere. In terms of universities, it is remarkable that we have, again I can't remember the numbers, but we have vastly more students studying creative arts than we do all sorts of engineering by many factors, by many multiples. And we know that on average studying creative arts earns you no more at all than if you haven't gone to university. So question, are there broader benefits from that in terms of the value to the individual, the value to society? Are we fooling kids into thinking they're going to be earning more because they go to university? What are the broader values from doing that? Certainly, let me put it this way: if I had a marginal pound, I wouldn't be putting it into universities. If I have a marginal pound to put into universities, I would be putting it into the higher economic value subjects like STEM.
And just one last question. Just have enough time. Yes.
Thank you. You've compared the tax model of the UK and also the National Health Service to other countries, in continental Europe and the US. And I was wondering if there's any particular country that you would propose emulating for both the tax model and the health service.
Yeah, that's a very good question to which I don't have a very sensible answer. I mean, the Dutch health service, for example, seems to work a great deal better than ours does without significantly more money. Now that seems to be down to a whole series of culture, management, history, and so on. In terms of tax systems, I mean, actually, I said earlier that if you look at continental systems, most of them raise quite a lot more than we do in one way or another. Often they don't do it in great ways, to be honest. They have very high levels of social insurance contributions, often taxed on the employer, so quite bad for employment. On the other hand, they do pretty much every country has a broader VAT base than we do. Going back to the issue about, so we could certainly emulate some of that. So I think there are bits from particular countries I think you can take from on the tax where, but the key thing in the end is actually to make the system as a whole work well. And it's quite hard to think of countries which have done that brilliantly, but it's quite easy to think of examples where they've got better taxation of housing. It's hard to think of a worse system of taxing housing than we have. So most countries do that better than we do. Actually, until the introduction in this last budget of the expensing in corporation tax, we had just about the most damaging corporation tax system for investment, given the structure, if not the rate, of a lot of countries. So moving in that direction, I think, has been is going to be helpful. The fact that our national insurance system is damaging, but actually a lot of European systems are more damaging than ours. So there's bits and pieces across the field there.
Unfortunately, that's all we have time for, everyone. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us here tonight. A special thank you to the IEA Book Club members, as well as the IEA donors who are in attendance tonight. For those of you who are not IEA Book Club members, if you'd like to ensure you receive invitations to future events, as well as get priority access to our books and have a chance to interact with the IEA and other leading authors, please do visit the IEA website or speak to my colleague Delino, who's got his hand up at the back of this room. From here, I'm delighted to inform you that Paul has agreed to stick around for a few minutes to sign any books that have been purchased.
Please do make sure you buy a book.
And please, indeed, for plenty of fantastic insights and anecdotes about UK fiscal policy, do please buy the book. It's available for sale in the Selson room just outside the back of this room. We're going to be serving drinks until 7:30 p.m. So please do stick around. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, if you enjoyed that conversation, why not watch one of these other videos? And while you're here, remember to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss out on a single IEA broadcast.